Hi there! Today's lesson is about mastering our vocal phrasing. This is actually the second lesson on this topic of vocal phrasing, and I will put a link to the first one at the end of this video. When we're talking about vocal phrasing, we're really referring to how we as singers deliver to our listeners the lyrics, rhythm, and to some extent the melody of the vocal phrase. Now you may have heard it said before that vocal phrasing is the thing that often separates the professional from the amateur sound. And to a large extent, that's true. In order to achieve a professional sound, it's not enough to just have stellar technique. The singer also has to be able to manipulate the vocal phrase in such a way as to make it his or her own without detracting from the vocal phrase or the composition. To put his or her own little stamp, own little personality on that vocal phrase without completely butchering it. And so in today's video, I'm going to talk about a few strategies for improving our vocal phrasing and making that vocal phrasing make more artistic sense, having it be more impactful to the listener. Now, if we were to listen to the same vocal phrase being sung by several singers, we will hear slight variations from singer to singer. Each of those singers is going to put his or her own little spin on the vocal phrase depending on how he or she interprets the lyrics, the story behind those lyrics, what kind of emotion that lyric or that story inspires in him or her, and also on his or her own natural speech patterns.
Let me see what spring is like on Jupiter and Mars.
Let me see what life is like on Jupiter and Mars.
Let me see what spring is like on Jupiter and Mars.
Let me see what spring is like on Jupiter and Mars.
Let me see what spring is like on Jupiter and Mars.
Now, some of these singers are using a technique called back phrasing, in which the singer intentionally sings the note slightly behind or ahead of the beat. And this sounds like it could be a recipe for disaster, and sometimes it can be. But the important thing with back phrasing, in order to make it really effective artistically, is to ensure that that equation that makes up the rhythmic framework of the composition checks off. Make sure it adds up. So I use back phrasing from time to time in some of the songs that I sing. And when I do this, I have to make sure that by the end of that phrase or by the end of the measure, I am back on beat. And so sometimes that means if I'm using back phrasing and I'm singing that note slightly behind the beat, I have to make sure that I'm making up for that little tiny rest that I'm putting in between notes by speeding up the notes that follow that rest so that by the time I get to the end of that measure, I'm back on beat. Otherwise, it will be a disaster. Otherwise, we're going to hear this really sloppy phrasing and this really poor sense of musical timing, which is not a professional sound. In order to ensure that our vocal phrasing sounds professional, it has to make sense. It has to make sense to us personally, but also kind of to the audience. And how we ensure that our vocal phrasing makes sense musically and artistically is we allow it to be guided by our interpretation or understanding of the lyrics, the emotion that those lyrics elicit in us, and our natural speaking patterns. So for example, if I speak the words, "Hey, I have something to tell you," how I'm going to pace that vocal phrase, the kind of rhythm that I'm going to use, is really going to be strongly influenced by the emotion behind it. And that emotion is going to be influenced by the story. What's happening right now? What's the context? So let's say I have some tragic news to impart. I have to tell you something really, really tragic. There's going to be a sense of sadness and hesitancy, and I'm probably going to slow down that phrasing. Hey, I have something to tell you. It's kind of a scary thing sharing bad news with someone, not knowing how they're going to react, not wanting to hurt that individual perhaps. And so there's this sense of hesitancy, this sense of, I don't want to put it out there even though I need to. But if instead the news is exciting, it's good news, hey, I've got something to tell you, right? There's this excitement, our words tend to flow a lot faster, we're not putting those pauses, we're not really taking a breath because we just can't wait to share this news. And here my inflection, right? My inflection changes and the tone of my voice changes. And those natural speech patterns, which include the rhythm and the spacing and the intonation of our voices, and to some extent the tone, the quality that we have, are really influenced by our understanding of the backstory, right? Something bad has happened, something good has happened. And then our emotional response to that, when we personalize that story, when we personalize that emotion and dig really, really deep into the emotion to be able to convey those qualities and textures in our voices, and to have that vocal phrasing make sense artistically and musically. A good example of allowing my interpretation and my emotions and my natural speaking patterns to influence my vocal phrasing is when I'm singing I'm a Stranger Here Myself. There's one line in particular, why is it wrong to murmur I adore him when it's shamefully obvious I do? Now when Kristen Chenoweth or Mary Martin, for example, sing the same vocal phrase, they tend to sing it pretty rhythmically. When it's shamefully obvious I do. But when I sing it, I put a little bit of a pause between the shamefully obvious and the I do. When it's shamefully obvious I do. And when I do that, I have to make up for that little extra time that I've taken with that rest by speeding up the I do just a little bit. Otherwise, it will be a very sloppy phrase and I'll be demonstrating poor musicianship. I have to, again, abide to some extent by the rhythmic framework of the composition. But there's a little bit of license. And there's a reason why I put this pause, why it makes sense to me artistically. And that's because, as I see it, this character is madly in love with this man who is not paying any attention to her whatsoever. She has always been the one to decide yes or no in a relationship. And now for the first time in her life, she's in love with someone and it's out of her hands. She has no control over the situation whatsoever. And when she uses the word shamefully, I get the impression that she's probably sort of throwing herself at him in a not so discreet way. And so there's this sense of hesitancy. She doesn't want to admit that for the first time in her life, she is not in control of the situation. So there's this when it's shamefully obvious, I do, okay, I'm madly in love with you. There's this once it's out there, once I show that vulnerability, once I say it, I can't take it back. And I'm finally admitting that you're in control and not me. And so the bottom line here again is that when it comes to making our vocal phrasing sound more professional and make sense, we have to really kind of analyze the lyrics. We have to think it through. We have to learn the story behind those lyrics, whether it's a character that we're playing in musical theater or a story that we perhaps infer into a pop or rock song if we don't know the whole story behind it, or what the composer is thinking, what inspired that composition. Really deeply personalize that story. And our vocal phrasing is going to make sense and it's going to work within the context and for the listener because it's going to sound very natural as opposed to robotic or some sort of thing that we've had to manufacture or overthink. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I really hope this video is helpful. Please let me know if you have any comments or questions. Leave them in the comment section below. And also, if you are not already a subscriber of the SingWise channel, please consider subscribing now so that you'll be notified for any future videos.